They built libraries. They mapped the stars. They preserved ancient Greek philosophy while Europe burned witches and buried knowledge. The Islamic Golden Age is often portrayed as a shining beacon in a dark world, a time when science, art, and architecture flourished under the wisdom of caliphs and scholars. And sure, parts of that are true, but here's the thing. What we don't talk about is what happened outside those palaces of enlightenment. We don't talk about the millions of people, Christians, Hindus, Zoroastrians, Africans, who were taxed, stolen, silenced, mutilated, and erased in the name of empire. Because while the Islamic Caliphates expanded with the pen, they conquered with something else entirely. They created one of the most effective systems of domination in world history, not just through war, but through bureaucracy, through religious law, through generational control. This isn't a hit piece, it's history, but it's the part of history that's often left out. So today, we're diving deep into 7 of the most brutal and systematic methods used by Islamic caliphates to keep conquered peoples under control. And warning, it wasn't just the sword, it was the scalpel, the tax ledger, the school, the bedroom, the silence, because domination doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Coming up first, the blood tax, a system so cruel it turned children into weapons. Imagine this, you're a Christian farmer in the Balkans. It's a quiet evening. You're eating with your family, maybe laughing with your son. He's 8, curious, smart, full of questions. Then the knock. It's not soldiers with swords, it's officials with scrolls. They're here for the devshirme, a word that meant collection, but what it really meant was they're taking your child. This was the Ottoman Empire's blood tax. Every few years, Christian communities were required to surrender their sons. The strongest, brightest boys were chosen, ripped from their homes, forcibly converted to Islam, and raised to serve the empire. But these boys weren't just trained, they were reprogrammed. They were cut off from their families, forbidden to speak their native language, isolated, indoctrinated, militarized. The best of them became janissaries, the Sultan's elite infantry, loyal, brutal, feared. Some of the empire's most terrifying military campaigns were led by soldiers who had once been stolen children. Here's a brutal stat. During one recruitment in Bosnia in 1568, over 12,000 boys were taken in a single campaign. That's not a war, that's a policy. And it worked, because what better way to control a people than to turn their own blood into your blade? One story that stands out, a young boy named Gjergj Castrioti, taken through the devshirme, raised as a loyal Ottoman commander. But one day, he escaped, and returned to lead a rebellion as Skanderbeg, the scourge of the empire that had trained him. Not every boy was so lucky. Most never saw their parents again. Many never even remembered who they were. Why did the Ottomans do this? Because it worked on every level, militarily, psychologically, culturally. It erased identity. It shattered resistance. It bred obedience. And if they didn't take your sons, they'd take something else. Coming up next, how entire generations of African boys were mutilated before they even reached the palace gates. Let's talk about a question most historians avoid. Where are the descendants of the millions of African slaves taken to the Islamic world? The answer is chilling. They don't exist. From the 7th to the 19th century, an estimated 17 million Africans were trafficked into Islamic territories. But unlike the transatlantic slave trade, where descendants of enslaved people live on, this trade left almost no trace. Why? Because of castration. Young African boys were captured, marched across the Sahara in brutal caravans, and before they ever reached cities like Baghdad, Cairo, or Mecca, they were castrated, not symbolically, not selectively, fully, without anesthetic, without antiseptic, without a chance. Most bled to death. Historical sources estimate that 70 to 90% of these boys died during the process. The survivors became eunuchs, placed in harems, palaces, mosques, and courts. They were guards, servants, even advisors, but never truly free. They were the invisible class of empire, always close to power, but always powerless. One Arab historian, al-Muqaddasi, described entire caravans where only 1 in 10 boys survived to see the city walls. And yet, the system continued for over 1,000 years because it served a purpose. The caliphates didn't just want slaves, they wanted slaves without legacy. No sons, no bloodlines, no future rebellion. Castration was empire-level damage control, a way to keep the machinery of servitude servitude running, without ever creating more people who might rise up. And to this day, the silence of those eunuchs still echoes through history. No memoirs, no family names, no graves with flowers, just absence. And if they didn't mutilate your body, they found another way to dominate you, financially, publicly, humiliatingly. Next up, the tax you paid just to stay alive, and the ritual designed to break your dignity. Imagine being charged just for existing, not for what you did, not for what you believed, just for what you weren't. That was the jizya, a tax imposed on every non-Muslim living under Islamic rule. And it wasn't just about money, it was about breaking you. Under Islamic law, Jews, Christians, Zoroastrians, Hindus, anyone who refused to convert were labeled dhimmis, or protected people. But protection came at a steep price. The jizya was a yearly tax that non-Muslims had to pay to stay alive, literally. But here's the twisted part, paying wasn't enough. You had to pay it publicly. You had to bow, sometimes kneel, sometimes even receive a symbolic strike on the neck to remind you where you stood. It was taxation. Yafazdur with humiliation baked in. Here's a wild fact. Under Caliph Umar II, so many non-Muslims converted to Islam that the empire started losing revenue from jizya. So he actually discouraged conversions because dead faiths paid better than loyal believers. In many regions, especially Egypt, Persia, and Al-Andalus, entire villages fled their homes just to escape tax collectors. Others pretended to convert, only to practice in secret. It wasn't just about money, it was psychological warfare. You couldn't testify in court. You couldn't ride a horse, only a donkey. You couldn't build new places of worship. You had to keep your doors painted a different color. Every part of your life whispered, you don't belong. The jizya was more than policy. It was pressure. Convert or keep bowing. And if they didn't get you with taxes or swords, they'd get you with desire. Because inside the palace walls was another system, one that weaponized beauty, loneliness, and power. Coming up, the women no one remembers, and the rooms they were never allowed to leave. Behind every empire is a palace, and behind every palace is a prison dressed in silk. We call them harems, but don't let the word fool you. This wasn't some romantic fantasy. It was a highly organized system of sexual slavery. The harems of Islamic empires, particularly the Ottomans and Mughals, weren't simply pleasure quarters. They were institutions, bureaucratic, strategic, ruthless. Thousands of women were captured, gifted, or bought, taken from across the known world. Circassians, Greeks, Ukrainians, Hindus, Abyssinians. Some were tributes from vassal states. Others were war spoils. All of them were property. They were trained, yes, trained to serve, to please, to obey, to compete for attention, status, and survival. They were stripped of identity, renamed and ranked. Only the most beautiful, intelligent, and submissive rose through the ranks. The rest disappeared into the system. Here's the shocking stat. At the height of its power, the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul housed over 1,000 concubines. Most were non-Muslim, most entered as children, most never left. One famous exception, Roxolana, a Ukrainian slave girl taken as a concubine, who rose through cunning and charm to become the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. But for every Roxolana, there were hundreds who were forgotten, buried in unmarked graves, never spoken of again. The harems weren't just about pleasure, they were political breeding grounds. Heirs were born from concubines. Entire dynasties rose or fell based on what happened behind velvet curtains. It wasn't just about controlling women, it was about controlling entire conquered populations by taking their daughters, erasing their bloodlines, and replacing them with imperial offspring. And if they couldn't erase your lineage, they'd erase your culture. Next up, libraries in flames, temples torn down, and civilizations rewritten in Arabic. When you conquer a people, you don't just take their land, you take their story. And the Islamic Caliphates mastered that art, because conquest wasn't just about soldiers and borders, it was about memory, and who got to write it. As Islamic empires expanded, from Persia to North Africa, from Spain to India, they didn't simply defeat armies, they dismantled belief systems, they destroyed sacred spaces. They replaced gods with one god and replaced languages with one language, Arabic. It was cultural reform acting on a civilizational scale. Here's the chilling part. In India alone, historians estimate that over 60,000 Hindu temples were destroyed or converted into mosques during Islamic rule. Among them, the Somnath Temple, one of Hinduism's most sacred sites, looted and desecrated multiple times, most infamously by Mahmud of Ghazni in the 11th century. But it wasn't just temples. Libraries, repositories of pre-Islamic knowledge were burned. In Persia, Zoroastrian fire temples were reduced to rubble. In North Africa, Berber languages were suppressed. In Spain, Christian and Jewish customs were regulated under constant threat of punishment. One of the most devastating examples, the destruction of Nalanda University in 1193 by Bakhtiar Khilji. Once the Harvard of the ancient world, with over 10,000 students and 9 million manuscripts, it was burned to the ground. Legend says the fires raged for months, fueled by texts no one would ever read again. Why do this? Because people without culture are easier to rule. Destroying temples wasn't just religious zeal, it was strategic. Wipe out their gods, replace them with yours, erase the past, and the future becomes yours to shape. But even when temples fall and libraries turn to ash, there's one last place empire tries to take control: your very thoughts, your words, your faith. Coming up, the laws that didn't just punish, but reshaped entire inner lives. You can burn a book, you can tear down a temple, but to truly conquer a people, you have to rewrite their minds. Islamic Caliphates didn't just enforce new rulers, they enforced new realities. Religious law, language, even thought patterns were gradually reprogrammed across entire populations, and they didn't need to burn everyone at the stake. They just needed time and Sharia. Under Islamic rule, laws weren't just about crime and punishment. They governed every aspect of life, from prayer to clothing to which hand you ate with. And for non-Muslims, the restrictions were even more suffocating. You were a dhimmi, a second-class subject. Your word in court meant less. Your public rituals? Restricted. Your books? Censored. And if you spoke your faith too loudly, that could be considered blasphemy, punishable by death. But the real genius of control? Language. In many regions, especially Persia, Egypt, and North Africa, local tongues were replaced or Arabized. Over time, even the way people thought changed. They didn't just pray in Arabic, the Gurni, they dreamed in Arabic. Here's a haunting stat. In less than 300 years, the vast majority of Zoroastrians, once the dominant faith of Persia, had either vanished, converted, or gone underground. Their rituals were lost, their language, Avestan, nearly extinct, and the method wasn't mass slaughter, it was legal suffocation. One Jewish chronicler from 12th century Al-Andalus wrote, "We may live, but we must whisper, even in our prayers." This wasn't just religion, it was psychological conquest, a slow, relentless erosion of identity, until one day your children don't remember your gods, or your language, or you. And yet, even under this pressure, some non-Muslims tried to survive, quietly, submissively, gratefully even, but the protection the caliphates offered them came at a cruel, calculated cost. Coming up, the twisted status of being allowed to live, but never to stand tall. We will not kill you, we will let you live, so long as you remember who owns your breath. That was the unspoken contract of life as a dhimmi, a non-Muslim protected person under Islamic Caliphates. Sounds generous, right? A system of coexistence? Not quite. Protection under Islamic rule didn't mean freedom. It meant tolerated subjugation. You were spared, but only under conditions designed to keep you small and silent. Let's break it down. As a dhimmi, you could not build new houses of worship, display religious symbols in public, marry a Muslim woman, testify against a Muslim in court, carry weapons, ride horses, only donkeys. And when you paid the jizya, you had to do it publicly, often kneeling with your head bowed, receiving a symbolic blow. This wasn't law, this was theater, a daily ritualized reminder. You are beneath us. Here's a painful fact. In 11th century Cairo, Jews were forced to wear yellow badges, Christians, blue ones. Centuries before Nazi Germany, the idea of color-coding religious minorities was already alive and enforced. But the psychological damage ran deeper. You were allowed to exist, yes, but you had to be grateful for that existence. You couldn't complain, you couldn't protest, you couldn't rise. You were protected, but not equal, spared, but not safe. One medieval chronicler wrote, "The dhimmi walks with his eyes lowered. If a Muslim passes, he must step aside." It wasn't just politics, it was identity erasure disguised as mercy. And this, more than the sword, more than the fire, is how the caliphates maintained dominance for centuries. They didn't just conquer lands, they conquered minds, generations, and souls. Coming up next, the final synthesis. What all of this really meant, then and now. By now you've seen the pieces, the children taken, the men mutilated, the women imprisoned, the faith suppressed, the languages buried, the histories rewritten, and the survivors marked, not with scars, but with silence. Individually, these may seem like cruel policies from a brutal time, but taken together, they form a blueprint, a calculated, interconnected system of domination perfected over centuries. This wasn't chaos. This was governance, designed to break resistance without needing constant war. The Devshirme turned the sons of the conquered into the empire's most loyal soldiers. Castration turned potential rebels into sterile servants. The jizya tax drained not just pockets, but pride. Harems turned daughters into wombs of imperial lineage. Cultural destruction wiped away the past. Religious law dictated even the inner voice. And dhimmi status ensured that any whisper of resistance was buried beneath generations of learned submission. This wasn't about religion alone. It was about power and the brilliant, terrifying ways it can bend people without even lifting a sword. And the most effective empires, they don't just conquer bodies. They conquer identity. They conquer memory. They make their rule feel like the natural order of things until the conquered begin to thank their conquerors for letting them live. And here's the real tragedy. Much of this history has been buried beneath layers of romanticized nostalgia. We praise the scientific advances, the majestic architecture, the calligraphy, but we forget the cost. We forget who paid for that golden age. Because history doesn't just disappear. It gets edited, sanitized, polished, then packaged for textbooks. But behind every golden dome is a shadow. Behind every caliph's decree is a child who vanished. A temple that born, a language that died. Empires don't always fall with a bang. Sometimes they live on in the things we no longer question. So ask yourself, when we remember history, whose version are we remembering? And whose stories were quietly erased one generation at a time?